Hello everyone, today we are talking about stingers. Now, in terms of stingers stats, my understanding they are extremely similar, if not pretty much the same to a regular flashbang. The differences being that stingers have a slightly wider radius. I think it's only about like 2 meters to my understanding. So it's not like it's a huge difference in terms of distance, but obviously a little bit more distance is going to help with stuff like air bursting, where you throw a grenade in the air, it explodes, so it can like hit more targets in line of sight. So it's not going to be like, you know, behind something and be blocked by whatever type of cover they're in. So throwing them in the air to, you know, have them explode in airburst is an effective tool, and having that a little bit more range is helpful. Now, when it came to like the key differences of why you'd want to use a stinger, I'll be honest, I kind of struggled trying to figure out why I would want to use one. And from a lot of my testing, I did try to use it in a variety of scenarios. So like, you know, in defensive manner, more aggressive types of manner. A lot of the time, whenever I was throwing a stinger, they didn't really behave any differently than regular flashbang a lot of the time. If you were to throw and swap out the grenade, a lot of the time it would just be very similar. Now, the instances where I did notice a big difference, where if I was using a flashbang instead of a stinger, was in more defensive scenarios where I was throwing stingers closer to myself. Now, there was situations where I was trying to push up to a location far away and I was throwing stingers to either try to reach somebody. A lot of the time, it didn't have any more radius significance than a flashbang. Generally speaking, it wasn't any more beneficial than just throwing a flashbang. Most of the time, when I was using the stinger, the issues that I kind of noticed occurring much more frequently in comparison to just using a flashbang was whenever I was in close quarters. Now, obviously, like throwing the grenade in air bursting is totally fine. It's maybe just slightly more effective than just throwing a flashbang. When it came to close quarter stuff, the stinger kind of started to show its weaknesses. And what I mean by that is anytime you were to misthrow a grenade and it bounces off and it's near you and you can't escape its radius, and of course it's a big one, so you basically always needed some form of cover to mitigate that, you are guaranteed going to get hit by it and have its effects of you getting, you know, narrow vision, you becoming slightly blurred in terms of your vision, and a lot of the time it would, depending on the distance to you, it would shake your character in terms of like how your character would move. So whenever you would get hit by it, your character would kind of stagger and kind of wobble kind of irregularly. So it was a little bit slightly harder to aim. Kind of think like when you throw a 9-bang, it's like creating an earthquake. It's kind of like a soft earthquake where it's not so jarring, but it's still like subtly kind of like swaying back and forth like you're kind of drunk or something. Now, if you were to use a flashbang in those scenarios and you were to fail to throw the flashbang and you got hit by it, if you have anti-flash goggles, that would be mitigated and lessened dramatically. With a flashbang, when you throw it, if you throw it and you don't have flash goggles on, what'll happen is that you're blinded with the bright light. Your eyes will adjust, they'll be like black, and then it'll kind of be blurry. But a lot of the time it's not any disorienting issues with your aiming. So a lot of the time, whenever you would misthrow a stinger, it was like really punishing. So from there, I had to really test to kind of see how or why I'd ever want to use a stinger, aside from just a slightly increased radius. What I came to realize was in this segment right here is this is me doing kind of like the range test. And during this range test, I discovered something interesting with how the stinger falls and moves. For one thing, the flashbang and stingers, in terms of my understanding, the stun length and the duration and, you know, the range, as I said, the only differences as far as I'm aware is that the stinger has slightly better range and can't be mitigated in any way except with flash goggles. When you're using a flash grenade, stingers can't be mitigated. So as I kind of continued to throw stingers and flash grenades, kind of alternating between each one, I did notice there was a different type of throwing pattern between them. Whenever I would throw them, there would be some irregularities. Now, when I threw a flashbang, it would sail straight until it hit a surface, and then it would roll off to the left. And then when I threw a stinger, what I noticed happening was that it would kind of glide and roll kind of more straight and direct. It didn't really deviate from its actual thrown path, whereas the flashbang, whenever it was contacting the ground, it would have a tendency to roll off to the left, kind of like in an arc around a location. So you could theoretically throw it, have it bounce off the ground, and like
Hey, you're finally awake. You were trying to cross the border, right? Walked right into that Imperial ambush, same as us.
Go around a corner potentially. And there's another type of throwing method where you crouch super low to the ground and you just, you know, this is just a regular throw as you might be able to see here. And in my testing. And then there is a different type of throw where you basically kind of skip it off the ground. And this can, like, you know, it's to mitigate any issues with how it's sailing. And once again, it was still the same thing. The flashbang would kind of land and roll off a left to the left. And then for the stinger, it would kind of keep true with its path. Now, what I started to notice when I was throwing the flashbang closer and closer is that it kind of behaved very similarly. Now, in comparison to the stinger, whenever I would throw it very, very closely, I started to notice some weird irregularities. And whenever you threw a stinger closer and closer to a surface in which you would impact it, so for example, if you were to throw it very close and it would hit a wall, I noticed it would bounce off the wall. But a lot of the time, because of how the stinger is shaped, there was kind of a certain level of whenever it was flying through the air, it kind of leveled out and it kind of had the same kind of trajectory, like it had the same kind of way of flying through the air, like spiraling a football, and it's flying through the air and it's spiraling through the air. That's kind of what happened with the stinger when you were throwing it. If you threw it closely, it would have an irregular kind of way of moving initially, and then it would straighten out kind of like an arrow. And I also tried bouncing it off of some types of surfaces. And the thing I really noticed with the stinger is that it has, whenever you impact something, and this is determined on how close or far away you were, if you were very, very close to something when you threw a stinger, what would end up happening was it had a sharper angle at which it would bounce off. Whereas the flashbang, if you were to throw it directly at like a wall and it was to like slightly graze it, it would kind of continue on that trajectory with a good amount of speed. Whereas when you notice when I throw it with a stinger, it would actually more sharply be directed at a different angle, kind of closer and back to you. So what does this mean? So whenever you are throwing a flashbang around a corner and you bounce it off a wall, it's gonna kind of, if you were to think it out in terms of like how the physics would be, it's just gonna kind of like deflect off of it, kind of think like a pool ball. It's going to hit and it's going to like bounce off kind of that way in some sense. Whereas the stinger, it lost more of its momentum and it had an issue flying further. So a lot of the time, whenever you throw a stinger, a lot of the time whenever I threw them far away, it wasn't an issue. But when I threw it closer, there was irregularities with bouncing angles coming back to me, losing a lot of momentum whenever I was like impacting something very close to me. Like if I were to throw it on against a door, it would kind of lose all of its momentum. And I believe that's just because it's hitting a particular part of the actual top of the grenade and it's losing all its momentum. And then it's kind of like irregularly bouncing off of it. Now I got this pretty consistently where every time I was throwing it close and hitting it off an object to bounce around a corner, it would bounce not very far and it would be a very sharp like return angle, if that makes sense, where as opposed to a flashbang where I would throw it at a door, it would bounce and it would bounce kind of predictably how you think it would kind of bounce around a corner. So the question then becomes for the stinger, when you're throwing stingers, you're obviously generally speaking not going to be able to throw it close because of obviously there is no way to kind of resist it except behind cover. And that's the same with flashbangs. Flashbangs, you have the anti-flash goggles. Stingers don't. Stingers are kind of worse at being thrown around angles. Flashbangs aren't. So every time I was measuring it in some measurable way where I was looking at how they flew, how they bounced off from different types of angles, the stingers always kind of ended up being on the short list for effectiveness and how you'd want to be using it around a corner or in close quarters in general. So like defensively, or you're trying to bank it around, you know, a certain object or a piece of cover, or hitting it off of a door frame or something. Now, it was kind of annoying how weird the stinger was. If you've ever thrown a knife, there's an understanding of how it rotates through the air, and at certain ranges it'll stick, and at other ranges it won't because it's still in the mid spin of that kind of projectile spinning. And that's kind of a way you should think about when you throw stingers. If at close ranges, they're just not great. There's no real good way to use them. They're more likely to have issues with them whenever you're throwing them through a tighter hole because of their shape. They are more awkward and you need to be throwing them more correctly. Whereas a flashbang, I found it a little bit easier threading it through the needles of doors, threading it through breaching shotgun holes with whenever you shoot through the door. And there was no way to mitigate those mistakes when you're using stingers, which also just was really a big bummer. So you look at the differences and you look at the flashbangs, you look at the stingers, and stingers have a better radius basically, and they have slightly better trajectories when you are skipping it on the ground in a straight line. So if you're trying to thread a stinger through a door at a very, very far distance, you could continue its momentum and it would be pretty accurate in terms of you throw it at this angle, it's kind of going to go that angle. The flashbang would trail off. Once it's impacted, it'll slowly start to curve off to the left. The stinger is going to have that better accuracy. The flashbang is going to have a slight curve to it. That's pretty much the only real differences I've noticed when I was throwing them for skipping and how they would bounce. And once again, as I said, the stingers always had issues coming through doors. Not always. You could still throw them through doors effectively, but there was this weird inconsistency because how your character kind of idles. It'll be kind of like a movement, obviously. So like you'll be like, you know, swaying back and forth. And if you throw a grenade and you throw that grenade and there's like a little bit of a sway to off to the side and you're not perfectly centered, you'll throw it and it'll bounce off of something. And I noticed with certain doors, it was really atrocious how often it would actually bounce off of the door in a very like, it would just lose all of its momentum at certain ranges. Whereas the flashbang was awesome and it would like really, really nicely bounce off and kind of what you would want to happen. Also, you can die from using stingers, which is kind of hilarious. I knew you could die to stingers. I didn't know I was taking much damage and there's no injuries associated with it, but I ended up dying, which I thought was really funny. So where do stingers fall into in terms of their usefulness? Honestly, that's a good question, and I'm not even sure if I know how to answer it properly, but through my testing and through kind of my conclusions so far, stingers are kind of like flashbangs that have slightly better radius, but they're more prone to issues. And then when those issues occur, there's no way to mitigate it, aka anti-flash goggles. So my recommendation is use flashbangs. They're kind of just the king. There can be stinger incapacitations because they can kill and incapacitate not only suspects or civilians, but then obviously you, of course. It's pretty rare that it'll ever happen, but obviously it can happen. So it's not going to be a beneficial thing when it does happen. It's going to be a negative. So having compared all of this stuff, it honestly just seems like a very big negative a lot of the time. And even though they do have a slightly bigger radius, whenever you would throw them, if you're throwing them at great distances, a lot of the time you can't get the advantage of it being a wider radius if you are throwing it at a great distance, because you can't cover that distance to take use of that effect. Whereas when you throw a flashbang, it's going to be slightly smaller radius, just very slightly, but you're still going to be able to be near the flashbang when it goes off, so you can like enter a room. Or if you throw it around a corner and you got to rush the corner, you can do it. Stingers, if you stun them, you throw it really far and it hits an enemy from really, really far away, it'll stun them, but you still need to be able to access and get that angle, actually take advantage of that, of course. And my consensus on how the stinger is going to be working and where I kind of, you know, say you should use it or not, honestly, it's just a slightly worse flashbang in my opinion. I'm not sure if anybody's going to be upset when I say that, but that's kind of my experience from comparing it to a flashbang in some sense. So if you like them, use them. They might have a slightly better odds at stunning targets at certain distances, especially if it's like a big wide room. A lot of the time it's not the case because usually you aren't interacting with huge ginormous rooms. And if you are throwing a flashbang and it's so far away that it's not stunning the target, it's probably not going to be hit. Like a stinger is probably not going to also stun that target either, just because of that distance. So for stingers, what is the purpose of a stinger? Honestly, it's just a slightly bigger radius flashbang, and it has a lot of smaller minor negatives. You have to be slightly better at how you use it because it's a little bit inconsistent in terms of the distances and ranges of how you're bouncing and throwing the stingers off walls or off objects, and you really have to have a lot of experience. And maybe because I had flashbang experience, so I was just been basically using a flashbang all the time, and I got used to how they were like bouncing or ricocheting off walls or whatever you want to call it. I just can instinctively use flashbangs slightly better. Stingers, as I said, they do lose a lot of momentum when you throw them around corners, but around that close stuff. So what's the purpose of a stinger? I guess it's just so you can be slightly more safe when you throw it in a big room with no line of sight. So you're just going to be slightly more sure. And also there's one thing I didn't mention. When you throw a flashbang, the enemies are like, ah, my eyes. But when you throw a stinger, they're just like, they just make pain noises. So it was slightly harder to differentiate from enemy, from foe, and even hearing if there was. If you have your volume turned up a lot, then it's not going to be a really issue. You can probably discern, you know, friend from foe. I have my volume down pretty low anytime I'm playing, pretty much. I'm usually just a visual type of player where I'm just looking and hearing and seeing the subtitles a lot of the time. So when it comes to what's the purpose of a stinger, it's just a slightly better more effective way to make sure that everything is stunned in the room, essentially. But there's so many more negatives associated with it. I would probably avoid it and just go with a flashbang, honestly. So that is going to be it for the video. Thank you for watching and have a good day.
Hey, you. You're finally awake. You were trying to cross the border, right? Walked right into that Imperial ambush, same as us.